"The time has come for the American colonies to declare independence from the British monarchy," exclaimed Benjamin Franklin in a louder voice than he normally spoke. "Congress has no other choice but to approve the Virginia resolution proclaiming our freedom. When that is done, we can go on with the important business of winning this war and governing ourselves." Franklin reclined in his favorite chair and rested his sore foot on a cushioned stool, keeping his foot elevated to help relieve the pain from the gout he had suffered for many years. He invited the Committee of Five to hold its first meeting in his 3-story brick Philadelphia home located only a few blocks from the Pennsylvania State House, where the Second Continental Congress met. "You're absolutely right. We all agree with you," John Adams said to Dr. Franklin and to the other 3 men sitting in Franklin's parlor that warm June afternoon. "I hope we can convince the delegates who are reluctant to support independence to vote with us." "We were given an important job," said Franklin. "Our assignment is to write a statement that clearly sets forth our reasons for breaking ties with the government of Great Britain. We must select the right man to write our Declaration of Independence." "There's only one man on this committee or in this Congress who can write the kind of statement we need," answered Adams as his eyes settled on Thomas Jefferson. "That man is you, Thomas." He turned in his chair so he directly faced Jefferson, who felt uncomfortable by his friend's attention. "We all know you're an experienced and able writer." Adams paused for a brief moment. "Gentlemen, I nominate Thomas for this important job." Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston looked at each other and nodded their heads. "We all agree," Franklin responded. After a few moments of hesitation, Thomas Jefferson spoke. "I appreciate your confidence, John, but I think the committee should appoint you. Virginia, as you know, recently declared its independence from the British government. My countrymen are now working to establish a new government. I would like to take part by helping to write Virginia's Constitution. In fact, I've already made some notes that I plan to take when I go to Williamsburg. John, you should write the Declaration. You led the fight to get us this far. You should be the one to write it." Adams was visibly agitated by what Jefferson said about going to Virginia. He tried to compose himself before speaking. "But you know how important it is a written declaration. A Declaration of Americans' Independence would be for the colonies. This is a matter that concerns all the colonies, all the citizens. This new government for Virginia is important, of course, but freedom for all our people is the most important business at hand." Adams was upset with himself that he had let his emotions get out of control. He paused and stood in front of Jefferson. "You are the best person, the only person, to write our Declaration of Independence. I urge you to accept." He returned to his seat. Jefferson felt compelled to return to Virginia. "What can be your reasons?" he asked as he looked directly into Adams' eyes. "Reasons enough," Adams answered. "Reason first, you're a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." Adams' enthusiasm and passion did not surprise anyone. He had been working for almost 2 years to convince the delegates to the Continental Congress that the colonies should break away from British domination. All eyes were fixed on Jefferson, who sat with his head bowed. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock that stood beside the window. He raised his head and looked momentarily into the face of each man. They watched as he crossed his arms and cupped his chin with his left hand. He stared at the floor in front of him. More time passed until he scanned the face of each man again. "If you are determined," he finally said, "I will do as well as I can." The members of the Committee of Five were meeting to make plans to write a Declaration of America's Independence. Earlier that day, John Hancock, president of the Second Continental Congress, had appointed John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut to serve on the Declaration Committee. Their job was to write a statement that would explain why the 13 American colonies were proclaiming independence from the British government. Before the Second Continental Congress would formally proclaim America's independence in a written declaration, the delegates from the 13 colonies first had to approve a resolution that officially proclaimed the colonies to be free and independent states. That resolution was the Virginia Resolution, which Richard Henry Lee of Virginia had presented to Congress on June 7th. The resolution plainly stated, Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Approval of the Virginia Resolution would grant the American colonies total independence from the government of England and give them the freedom to govern themselves. And later on, fellers and gals, when we read the Declaration, you'll remember that parts of it sound very much like this Virginia Resolution. The Virginia Resolution, also known as the Lee Resolution, was first approved by the Virginia Convention on the previous May 15th, which would have been about 3.5 weeks before. Since Richard Henry Lee was in Williamsburg, Virginia's capital city, when the resolution passed, he was given the responsibility to take it to Philadelphia and present it to Congress. The delegates from the colonies had debated the Virginia Resolution for 3 days after Lee introduced it. Then on June 11th, they voted to postpone the final decision until July the 1st. They wanted to give the colonies that had not made a decision on the question of independence more time to decide. In order to avoid any delays, if Congress voted to approve the Virginia Resolution, President Hancock had appointed the Committee of Five to prepare a formal written declaration of America's independence. Hancock also appointed 2 other committees, one to prepare a constitution that would unite the new independent American states with a central government of limited powers, and a second committee to draw up a plan to form alliances with foreign countries. And that, fellers and gals, was a very important document because the young American colonies were going to need some help from other countries if they were going to win a war for their freedom against the nation of England, which was a very powerful and wealthy country. After the Committee of Five adjourned, Jefferson returned to his lodgings at the Graff House, where he rented a furnished 2-room corner suite on the 2nd floor from Jacob Graff, a Philadelphia bricklayer. Jefferson's suite faced the corner of 7th and Market Streets. He spent the rest of the night thinking about his new assignment and what lay ahead for the colonies. Jefferson found the Graff House more comfortable than where he lived when he first arrived in Philadelphia a few weeks earlier on May 14th. The new residence was located on the outskirts of town. It was peaceful and provided him more space. His suite consisted of a bedchamber and a sitting room. The only furniture that belonged to him was a Windsor chair he had bought. One of the few complaints he had about his new lodging was the horseflies that flew into his room from the stable across the street. As he settled in his chair by the sitting-room window, hoping to catch a cool breeze, he could see the lamplighter making his rounds through the city streets. He watched the tall, middle-aged man raise the long pole with the flaming wick on the end to light the oiled street lamps, bringing a soft glow of light to the streets of the city known as the City of Brotherly Love. At precisely 8 o'clock, Jefferson heard the bell from the tower of the Pennsylvania State House toll 8 times. The sound of the chiming bells echoed throughout Philadelphia. The bell would later be renamed the Liberty Bell. And some of my family and I had the privilege of seeing the Liberty Bell when we visited Philadelphia 4 or 5 years ago. It's a great, huge bell. They can't ring it anymore because it's got a crack in it. Jefferson's thoughts were on the reasons why the colonies were on the verge of taking action to declare independence from the British government. Like most Americans, Jefferson could not forget what had happened on April 19, 1775. That was the day the military conflict between the colonies and the English government began at Lexington and Concord. British troops had marched to Concord, Massachusetts, to capture the Patriots' supply of arms and ammunition. When the Patriots received an early warning that British troops were coming, they moved their supplies to a safer place. Before the day was over, the British killed 49 Massachusetts citizens and wounded dozens more. Since the British marched on Lexington and Concord, Jefferson had supported the American colonies, severing ties with Great Britain. Jefferson also thought back to an earlier incident in 1770, when 5 Boston citizens had been killed by a small group of British soldiers in what had become known as the Boston Massacre. The unfair taxes that had been imposed on the colonists and the stationing of British troops in their homes had served to ignite this controversial event and to unite the people in their opposition to English domination. For more than 10 years, the Americans had protested and resisted the violation of their rights and privileges as British subjects. But King George III and the British Parliament still continued to mistreat them. In the early fall of 1775, Congress learned that King George had rejected the Olive Branch petition, which had been approved by Congress on July 8th. In this last attempt at reconciliation, Congress hoped the petition that affirmed America's loyalty to the King and to Great Britain, and that had included an appeal for a better relationship with the British government, would prevent armed conflict. However, instead of accepting the Olive Branch petition, the King issued the Proclamation of Rebellion on August 23rd that declared the colonies to be in a state of open and avowed rebellion. He ordered British officials to use their utmost endeavors to withstand and suppress such rebellion. The severity of the American situation grew worse when it was learned that King George had hired German mercenaries to fight alongside the British Army in America. From that moment, they knew the King planned to use whatever force was necessary to force the colonies to accept the new taxes and restrictions the British government imposed upon them. And part of the reason that this was such a serious move, guys and gals, is because these German mercenaries were going to fight differently than the British. The British, it's true, were sometimes harsh and even barbaric toward the Americans, but many times they were not. Many times they honored the rules of war, and they treated prisoners and civilians with reasonable leniency. But these guys from Germany, they had no relationship with these Americans. They were just foreigners, didn't even speak the same language, whereas the British and the Americans were united by a common heritage, a common religion, and a common language. So it was to be expected that these German soldiers, who were simply hired mercenaries, guys who fought not for a cause but for a paycheck, would be harsh and bitter in their prosecution of the war. And as we learned in some of the other books I've read to you, they indeed were that way. But the Americans saw this coming, and that's why they were so upset when the King hired these foreigners to come and fight his own people. These and other events had caused a growing number of Americans to realize that complete independence from Great Britain was their only option. Their rights had been violated long enough. They would continue to oppose those actions they believed to be unjust and to defend themselves against the British military for as long as necessary in order to become a free people. Congress in some colonies had already taken the first steps toward independence. On April 12th, the North Carolina 4th Provincial Congress passed the Halifax Resolves, which were the first instructions by any colony to authorize its delegates to the Second Continental Congress to vote for independence from the British government. On May the 4th, 3.5 weeks later, Rhode Island became the first colony to declare its independence from Great Britain. On May the 10th, the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution that recommended that each colony write a constitution to establish a new government. 2 colonies followed the congressional recommendation and adopted a constitution and an independent government: Virginia on June the 20th and New Jersey on July 2nd. New Hampshire on January 5th and South Carolina on April 12th were the first colonies to both declare independence and adopt a constitution. By the end of 1776, 5 more colonies, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, would establish independent governments. All of these actions were in addition to the Virginia Convention's adoption of the Virginia Resolution on May 15th, that, if approved by the Second Continental Congress, would declare independence for all 13 American colonies. These thoughts went through Jefferson's mind, and he began to realize the importance of the declaration he had been asked to write. He knew it would be a difficult task. He would have to use all the knowledge and skills he possessed to draft a statement that would explain the common-sense reasons why the colonies had no other choice but to gain independence from Great Britain. As he rose from his chair to prepare for bed, Jefferson dedicated himself to write a statement that would clearly express the American mind on the rightness of their actions.